Hey, Strong Girls. I'm Molly Herford, sports journalist, ultra runner, cyclist, and author, and founder of Strong Girl Publishing.
And I'm Dr. Sasha Golish, Executive Director of Yellow Running Shoes, a researcher, engineer, elite runner, and your BFF who's breaking down the science of smashing barriers in women's sports.
Think of us as the intersection of science and culture for women and girls in sport. Each week, we'll dissect the latest headlines and cutting-edge research on female athletes.
Debunk myths about girls in sport. Talk about how hormones affect performance at every age, to the latest research in sports science around mental performance, nutrition, equipment, and so much more.
And we'll spotlight badass girls and women who are rewriting the rules of the game, sometimes literally.
Expect it to be nerdy,
And occasionally TMI.
but it will always be honest.
Whether you're a strong girl yourself or you're raising one, this show is for you. Welcome to Strong Girl Talk.
Where sports science meets sisterhood.
Hey Sasha, how's it going?
Hi, Molly. How's it going?
It is going, you know what, a little slippery and a little messy outside as we navigate this Canadian winter. I'm not going to lie. And I know you haven't been able to do that much this past week.
No, I have not been able to enjoy the, Canadian winter. And I know so many of my fellow Canadian friends kind of complain about winter. And I was so excited as we had so much snow. So by the time this comes out, there's a very small chance I've had the surgery, but probably not. Anyways, my knee's done, right? And so if you follow me on social media, I've been talking about it. But, I haven't been able to, play in winter the last week as I want to, right? I've been alpine skiing, Nordic skiing. Okay, I haven't been winter running, obviously, but doing all those things. And it's been tough. You've been awesome. We talked about role models in our first episode, and it really inspired me. And you've just been an awesome support. But, super related, I was sitting in my, doctor's office yesterday chatting with him. And he's like, oh my gosh, there is no research on females and how they respond to the surgery. So
You're like, great, thanks. Excited to be your first. This is one of the situations where you don't want to get there first, right?
Right? You're like, okay, I know the outcomes are great with males, but females?
Question mark, which is funny because we already had today's topic. We already had all of the notes for where are we at with female athlete research. And then you got a real world taste of that by being told we're nowhere with it in this particular case.
Yeah.
Which, is super scary. So I think, a lot of people listening to this are like, a knee is a knee is a knee. But can you maybe kind of talk about why this matters? Even just when we're talking about surgeries that aren't just we're talking about nether regions and labia and vulva. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about we all have knees.
Right. I mean, for me, I get back to the idea of when did I really start paying attention to sports science? And so anecdotally for me, it was around the Q angle. So this is knees, right? So you think about male and female puberty, right? And when females go through puberty, their hips open up. So people are like, you just said Q angle. What is a Q angle? So think
It's true. I was thinking. I didn't want to say anything.
Well, but I'm glad you did. So it's that angle from your thigh bone, all the way down to your tibia, right? And so if you think about yourself lying in bed at night and you're lying on your back, right? If you think about a typical male body and a typical female body, female hips are going to look more like a triangle than straight. And so naturally sort of what happens is we get a little bit more pressure on our knees. And so probably what's happened over time, so my injuries related to my cartilage is that, I've just got a little bit of different angles happening with my knee. Now, with science and sports science, some of my frustrations, how do they measure the Q angle? Like I said, like you were lying in bed. I don't know about you, Molly, but when I'm playing sports, I'm generally not
lying in bed.
Yeah, so the Q angle is generally a static calculation. And so I'm really looking forward to the future as they start to measure it more dynamically as our hips, our knees, our ankles, our really cool biological systems move. But short story, female knees have a little bit of different forces running through them, which is probably where I am today.
Okay. So, I guess we'll see in a couple months how well this first ever surgery goes. Obviously, we are deeply rooting for you. I'm sure you're going to come through swimmingly. But I think that's just such a great, point around, there is all of this research that is very much missing. How are you going to feel if you end up being a case study in a research paper instead of putting together research papers?
Oh my gosh, N of one. I mean, we'll talk about this later, but we're all a case of N as one. Happy to be part of case studies, right? I hope that when they go in my knee with a little scope, that like they take the imagery and they use it, right? Like science gets better when we use all this data that we're collecting in a positive, strength-based way.
Absolutely. Okay, so before all of this knee stuff happened, how would you have answered the question, where are we with female athlete research? Like, I know at the moment you are compiling just reams of information, kind of comparing and contrasting, all of like the primary articles that are typically referenced when we're talking about sports science, and kind of seeing where the female research is stacking up against the male. But yeah, where are we at, generally speaking?
I mean, we're nowhere. Is the
There we go.
Short, terrible answer. But I mean, this dabbles a little bit in your space, right? 2023, Christine Yu released a book called Up to Speed, and it was called The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. And it sort of strategically came out around 50 years post Title IX. And actually, I'm going to pass it back to you. I mean, I'm the Canadian in the room, and you're the American, and I really should let you comment on what Title IX is.
Oh, boy. So essentially, yeah, Title IX is just this idea that we have to have equality, equity in women's and men's sports, particularly when it comes to the collegiate level of athletics, which, as we know, like collegiate and high school sport really is a microcosm for then what we see in professional sport afterwards. If there's not a strong college component, the odds are pretty good that you're not going to see a strong professional component in that sport. I look at women's cycling, and I can say that's why North America still doesn't have a lot of strong women's cycling. Like, we have a few incredibly strong, dominant women's cyclists, but we do not have as many as, like, say, the Netherlands, where there is a much stronger youth sport, young men's, like, sport for that. It's not part of college curriculum, basically. So, yeah, Title IX is extremely important from the research perspective as well.
Yeah.
If you think about even like, so you're a sports science person, you've been in this field for decades. Pre-Title IX, before, universities and colleges were kind of forced to add in more women's programming, guess where all the research tends to be done? At universities. Guess what their sample size was? All the boys.
So that it highlights how far we've come, but really how little we know about the sex bias and how it's impacted research and then athletics performance. Not athletics, because not track and field, all of athletics. Sorry about my stumble there. But, like in the words of Stacy Sims, right, women are not small men. But for a long time in science, and particularly in sports science, we accepted women as men, but just with different reproductive organs.
Yes, and I mean, actually, I think Stacy is really where women's research kind of came to light. 6 or 7, no, probably 8 or more years ago when Roar came out. So Roar, fantastic book written by Stacy Sims, Celine Yeager, who I actually talked about in the role model episode. There we go, full circle. Fantastic book that covers everything, menstrual cycle, nutrition, injury, just everything really within, how it pertains to women, how things change for women. I think that really kicked off a lot of conversations. But I do think the problem, too, though, was everyone kind of, like, saw that book, thought it was amazing, but we're kind of like, oh, so the research is done. Like, here's the information we need. And it's like, hold the phone.
Right.
We're just scraping the surface, Like, when we talk about, like, training with your menstrual cycle.
Right.
Like, does it actually make sense? Is it realistic? Even Stacy, when you interview her, we'll talk about the fact that, like, yeah, sure, maybe there's certain things that, like, will be better during the luteal phase, but guess what? If you're racing, or any kind of competing, or even, like, casual recreational competing, your period doesn't really care when it's falling. It's just happening.
Right.
So, to some extent, I think she would even say she's sort of annoyed at how it's been a little bit mismanaged in traditional media.
Yeah.
Where we sort of suddenly talk about, like, oh, yes, the week before your period is not the week to do any, like, heavy work or, really, like, be gentle, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, but my Ironman's that week. What do I do? I think it's really kind of set up this, like, weird, almost, like, step backwards of, like, oh, we are so different throughout our cycle, which means, A, we, like, can't do the stuff that we want to do, and then B, like, now there's almost like an argument against researching women, like females in sport, because they can be like, oh, well, we can't control for the period.
Right.
We can't control for the menstrual cycle. It's so different. So no matter what we do,
Right.
we just can't do it.
Right.
And I think you and I have talked about this, like the barrier to even getting research approved and like funded and published around female athletes is trickier than male athletes, which, like, yes, we should be like only publishing good research, but
Right.
like when you have like when you've created so many barriers
Yeah.
to what counts as good research, we're not going to have any research.
Ugh, we're also going to have a topic one day of like what is good research. But coming back to the sports science topic, you know, like you asked me the question, like how much research is there? And so in what Christine Yu highlighted in her book, between 2014 and 2020, only 6% of sports science research focused on women. And women made up only 34% of study participants.
The sad part is, I think we were all supposed to be like, woohoo,
Right.
about that, because we were finally getting 6%.
Right. But, you know, it's just not enough, right? And so, you know, going back to your other point about controlling for the menstrual cycle. So for the longest time, that's why people weren't comparing males and females. They didn't want to control for it. We've got way better technology. And it actually could be something as simple as like, hey, when was your last period? Right? And then in the study, we can control for where you're at. And a couple things might come out. Actually, a couple things will definitely come out if I'm just going to like put a hypothesis on here. For most people, probably where they are in their cycle doesn't impact their performance. When we talk about the tippy top of elite, we know that 0.1% of a performance can make a difference. And so it's actually learning, as you said so eloquently, learning to work with it as opposed to against it. And then I think, secondly, what's potentially going to come out of all of this is that we don't actually need to necessarily control for it. And so that we can include females in sports science the way we had typically been controlling men, right? And so that we can, you know, stop disempowering women, right? By saying like, oh, you're so different that this can't possibly be for you. And it's like, well, hold on. So am I allowed to do my deep dive on this like giant paper that from 2024 in the summer?
I would love it if you did this deep dive. And I mean, I think what we also just said, though, like, if you think about the Q angle thing,
Right.
like, tell me menstruation impacts that. Like, it maybe a tiny argument could be made, but like the knee, like your knee surgery, like there's
Right.
no reason that female athletes like haven't had any kind of like stuff done on that. Like, it just seems bizarre to me that we're just gonna say like, yeah, knees or like a rotator cuff or something. Like, well, you have a period.
Right.
We can't touch concussions because you have in female
Right.
athletes because you have a period.
Right.
Like, I know everything is connected. The body is a holistic organ. Yada yada. But
Right. And there is some evidence emerging that with ACLs that you may be more likely, but it's again, what's the significance, right? Like how much more likely are you to tear ACL? I'm using acronyms again. Sorry, people. Your anterior cruciate ligament.
Oh yeah, that's so much better, Sasha. Thank you so much for that. I
Okay.
really understand it now.
It's the ligament in your knee that makes it stable. I was getting there. I'm not sorry that I'm such a science nerd. But, you know, there is some, you know, emerging evidence that perhaps there's a little bit more laxity depending on where you are in your period. But is it significant? Right? Like, is it 0.1%? Is it 1%? Is it 10%? And I think this is where we need to do more research. And I think for now, what we, to your point, need to think about is instead of seeing that as a barrier, it's an awesome opportunity.
Yes.
So,
Okay, nerd out. Hit me.
okay. In July, I'm at this conference in Innsbruck on psychology, and this paper comes out from the International Journal of Sports Psychology and Performance. And it's called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And it was Essential Papers in Sport and Exercise Physiology. And I was walking with Kathy, so Dr. Catherine Sabiston, leading body image researcher, just kind of leading sports science researcher too. And I turned to Kathy and I'm like, I wonder how many women were included in the study. And from that moment, I really wanted to do this like deep dive into, at first it was just the study participants, and then sort of, you know, as my brain continued, it was on who actually picked these articles and how and why, although that's not actually given in the article, and then who actually authored these. So let's just go back for a second. So,
I want to hit on the importance of like just calling this standing on the shoulders of giants. Oh shit, neither of us can say that.
Right.
Essential papers in sports and exercise physiology. So the point of this is really setting up the 100 papers that are included to be essentially the curriculum.
Right.
You want to do sports science, boom, these are the papers that are like, we've just decided these are the papers, these are, the most information, the most important, the most well done. So that's huge.
Huge.
Like, that is extremely important. That, not only impacts like how potentially thousands of exercise science students are, now, getting this information. It also impacts things like funding,
right,
and all of that fun stuff,
right.
So yeah, the ramification. It's not just like a casual paper in a journal. Like the ramifications of that are actually like quite like there's a long tail to the ramifications of that putting out that paper.
Right, and it's actually, so then thinking like an engineer, because I'm an engineer too, is like the intended and unintended consequences. So anyways, okay, got to go back to that 6%. So that article that looked at the articles from 2014 to 2020, in their paper, they included 5,200. So there's 5,200 physiology papers in that paper, and only 6% of them include women. So it's shocking that from that 5,200, we're saying that there's 100 papers that actually inform. So yes, you can imagine the deep dive. So overall, there were 2 authors. We'll get to the gender differences in a minute. And then another 50 referees, and all of those people were asked to submit their 25 top papers. And so in the first round, they ended up with 396 papers. And from those 396, they had a voting criteria, which is not included in the paper, but knowing some of the scientists and referees, I'd say it was done in a rigorous way. And so their conclusion was, this is a list of studies that will provide a perspective on contemporary studies, the giant's shoulders, quotation marks, that, to your point, enable scholars to further see or understand where they've come from. And before I go further and share more of the details, I do want to say I have a ton of respect for all of the science in here.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not to say anything is wrong with any of the papers included.
Well, asterisks, but yes.
Yeah, this is not to say that the research was done poorly or things like that. This is just to say we question a lot of things about it.
Yeah. So, you're probably asking, what was actually included in the paper? So there were things that, aren't surprising, like muscle physiology, aerobic and anaerobic work, endurance training, strength training, tapering, and performance. So there was a total of 14 different categories. You can imagine what my spreadsheet organization looks like. And some of these topics had more papers, right? I don't think it's surprising, in the fields that we talk about, that there were 18 papers in performance and 17 papers in the aerobic category. So that's 35% of the 100 papers.
Do you know how far, what the oldest paper included was?
1920. Right?
I would have just had to bleep myself.
So in 1920 and in 1922, 2 physiologists actually won the Nobel Prize. And this is sort of like the birthplace of modern sports science. And, I think it's really cool that there was a Nobel Prize. Oh, it'd be cool if it was a Nobel Peace Prize. Sport and physical activity really is about peace.
100%.
But they won the Nobel Prize. It'd be interesting, actually. That's another, data dive for me to do. Who else has won the Nobel Prize that's related to sport? So if we then break down the articles even further, if you go before sort of 1980, many of the articles are empirical science. And you're going to give me the look of what's empirical science? And I'm like, okay, fair enough.
I was giving her that look.
So think of, if you don't like chemistry, and I loved chemistry, being in the chemistry lab and doing an experiment, right? So they're your traditional science experiments. And then sort of after 1980, what we see more is a review. And reviews are a collection of papers where you bring together their methods and their conclusions, and you then draw your own conclusions from what the papers have presented. And I guess it's no surprise that sort of, after the 80s, as the paper explosion has occurred, that we're going to see more of these reviews. And I do actually want to one day explain all the different types of studies, so I hope we can entertain that one.
I think that's actually very important for any woman who's listening to podcasts, reading articles, even articles in publications that we consider to be very, thorough and thoughtful and not fake newsy. I'll say as a journalist, we haven't gone to school for this stuff, and it's pretty easy to, get pitches or get like Science Daily News, whatever, and have it say like, oh, a study has found XYZ, and you're sort of reading the press release of the study.
Right.
That maybe doesn't necessarily highlight that it was done on 4 people and a mouse.
Okay, hilarious. There was a study that was 4 men and some rats.
Oh my God, I was right. I didn't even see that in here. I just said it.
Hilariously, I was like, oh my gosh, they're for sure male rats. They were interestingly female rats. The rest of the animals that were like in the studies were males, but anyways.
I have so many questions about that. Were they just like, oh, okay, we need some women in this. Shirley over there in the cage, she'll work.
I actually couldn't download that article because I was really curious as to why it was female rats, but I will get my hands on that article one day. But I'm really excited that you asked that question and that we will explore the difference between sample sizes and how different studies are done so that people have a better understanding. And then if I'm going to be up on my soapbox, I'd really like to see more science open sourced.
100%, because the problem isn't just that it's not just that I'm reading a press release, it's that when I click through, I can't access the study.
Right. And there's so little information given in, we were joking about this morning, the abstract, which should really be called the specific, because it's not abstract, it has specific details. But there's not enough in the abstract for you to actually understand who the sample was on and if you can draw conclusions in your own life. So in the interest of promoting good science, I'm going to take you through my scientific process to actually look at this. So the first thing I had to do was create a research question. And so your research question is the overarching question that you're trying to answer. And so my research question to set this up was, to what extent does Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, the essential papers in sport and exercise physiology, reflect gender equity in its selection of authors, research subjects, and editorial decision-making processes? And what implications does this have for the representation of women in sport and exercise science? It's a mouthful, but it's rigorous.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, really, what did I want to know? I wanted to know the percent of women who were referees. I wanted to know the percentage of women who were included as part of the study samples. And I wanted to know the percentage of women who were authors on these essential papers. Do you want to take any guesses?
Oh, geez, I'm going to go really low. I'll be shocked if any of these numbers goes over... shocked if it goes over 30%. Pleasantly surprised if it goes over 15%.
Okay. I like your...
My over-under?
Well, just the optimism, right? So going back to your point, I do want to say I tried to download as many of these articles as possible. I really wanted to make them available to everybody, and I'm not going to be able to do that. They're behind a paywall. And I'd love to, I can't ask all the authors. Some of them were written in 1920, and, beautiful obituaries read about these individuals. But I'd like to see if there's a way of working with these authors who wrote this paper, if we could make this open access. So kind of going back to this, in terms of how did I evaluate this? So in downloading the papers, there was a couple ways I did this. I went to a place called ResearchGate. And so ResearchGate is it's social media for researchers is the
But not in a sexy way.
Not in a sexy way at all. Although, yeah, sexy to me, maybe. I'm a scientist. But basically, it's a collection of your papers. And so there's pictures of some of the authors. And then where there wasn't that, I did a Google search. And then there were just some names where I was like, you're a man. Like James something the fourth. No woman is named,
Yeah, we can safely assume that. And
yeah.
Let's maybe add that there's a plus or minus couple percentage points for error here.
Totally. But, if we err on the side of being conservative, probably more of those authors that I couldn't find, and there were very few of them, were men. And, those were particularly the ones in the 50s and 60s where they were, listed in the middle of the article and probably didn't go on to practice in this field. So here's what we learned. Ready for a shocker?
Ready for it.
Neither one of the main authors was a female.
And that's for the Shoulders of Giants paper itself.
Yes. Yeah. So there were 2 main authors.
Yeah. Color me shocked.
So they included themselves in the list of the referees. So in total, they invited 50 other referees. And so I'm saying invited. It wasn't clear on how they picked their referees, but they invited 50 other individuals to partake in evaluating these studies. 17% of them, a shocking 9 of them were women, and the rest were men.
Couldn't even get us to 25%.
No. And then, if we look at the studies as a whole, so in the 100 papers, there were 340 authors. 37 of them were women. That's less than 11%.
Which, we can posit part of this is the problem of like when you're including research from the beginning of exercise physiology.
Right.
We're going to 1920. Very few women who would have been in this field, who would have been in colleges, et cetera, et cetera. You really probably don't have that many women authors on papers in general until, say, after the 80s, 90s?
Yeah, and I should find this statistic. They did actually, outside of sports science, look at the number of female authors on papers, and it's like we're nowhere near 50%.
Yeah. And to me, that actually means that I think while, yes, we're standing on the shoulders of giants and we want to go back to like find the essentials, we maybe should have weighted some of the more modern classics, if you will.
Right.
Maybe with a little bit more, have a little bit more weight to them.
Sure, and maybe that's a reflection of the referees. So I want to leave from a strength-based perspective, but it's also still a deficit. So the number of studies, right? So there's 100 studies. You will not find this shocking that there were 0 studies that included females only. I mean, you made a really good point, right? A lot of these come from earlier where women would not have been studied. I mean, looking at Title IX alone, women weren't really considered athletes until the 1984 Olympics.
Mm-hmm. However, really, one couldn't
I
be
know.
just women. Like, that to me is, honestly, it's appalling. Like even just from an optics perspective from these authors who put this list together, to say that there is no research done on female athletes, females within exercise physiology, that is worthy of being included in the essential reading. Like, that's what they're saying.
Yeah. And I'm going to asterisk that to say, you are so right. And I wish they had said, these are the 100 papers. So the cutoff date was 2012. So they said it had to be written before 2012 to measure impact and where it had been cited. But I think what they should have done, you make a really good point, is, since 2012, we've done some really interesting work with females alone. And these, handful, so 5 articles, are leading sports science articles in female science. So Molly, here's my promise to you. I'm going to go find 5 really important articles for us to share at a later date.
Love it.
And ones that are making a really big difference. I mean, I think about Christy Elliott-Sale working over in the UK and the incredible work that her and her team are doing. Kathy Sabiston and all the stuff that she's doing at the University of Toronto. Louise Burke, Margot Mountjoy. Like, there are just so many strong, powerful women making such a difference in female sports science. So, I mean, I love going on a science deep dive. So, like, selfishly, thank you.
Anytime. And you know what I feel like? I think we need to maybe do like a list of the standing on the shoulders of giants for female exercise physiology. Like,
standing on the shoulders of the Valkyrie?
Yeah. I was trying to think of like strong I love it. All right. Look for that coming from us. All right. Well, let's wrap up there for this episode. You can find us over at stronggirl.substack.com or just find links over at Strong Girl Publishing or, of course, Yellow Running Shoes. I'm Molly Herford.
I'm Sasha Golish.
Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next week with another awesome episode.